Welcome to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Francesca Ceni and I work as a program officer in the technical assistance branch of the Secretariat, and it is a pleasure today to introduce briefly the features of the e-waste challenge MOOC, the massive open online course that was launched on the 4th of April and will remain available. It will not close for 8 weeks. There are interactive sessions like the one of today, and after these 8 weeks it will be still possible to study and to take the MOOC and to go through it. So I briefly introduce it. Many of you have already seen this presentation, and so I will be very brief. So the MOOC was developed in partnership between the Climate Kick, KU Lowell, and it is a pleasure today to welcome Katya Biedenkov, who is teaching at KU Lowell for the lecture of today, and also the World Resources Forum, as mentioned, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions Secretariat, and together with the Climate Kick, also the new partner, the EAT Raw Materials Kick, is a partner to this adventure. The MOOC is designed for a wide audience: university students, policymakers, business managers, and recycling operators. It offers a wide range of resources and also helps the learners to go deeper into the subject of the sound management of e-waste. As mentioned, it is not time limited, and the learners can take the MOOC at their own pace and consider to invest about 40 hours of learning, which it can be organized in 8 weeks or longer, depending on the availability of time. The learning is activity-based and helps the learners to put the problem into their context. The MOOC is hosted on the platform, the Innovation Primer of the Climate Kick, where also other MOOCs are available on climate change, and it is organized in 5 modules. The lecture of today is reflected in Module 2 and also a little bit in Module 4. In Module 2, e-waste around the world is looking at regulations in the country of the learners and also in general in several continents. And then in Module 4, there are incentives and opportunities which are of course supported by policies. In order to obtain the certificate, it is necessary to submit a challenge, a canvas or a project, which has to be an innovation for the learner to resolve the issues and the problems linked to the sound management of e-waste. The MOOC offers a learning community, and there is a forum, a discussion forum for each nugget, which is a subset, a subunit of a module. And it is possible to discuss with other learners and compare the situations and the solutions. So join us on the MOOC and help advocate solutions to the challenge of e-waste. This is the link. You can start taking the MOOC from today, and you will have your time to complete it at your own pace. I just want to repeat that there is another partner in this adventure, and it is the EIT Raw Materials Kick. So I now pass the floor to Dan and to Katya for the presentation of today.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. Otherwise, let me know right now. No, it seems to be good. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to give this short presentation about a very broad topic about which I guess we could talk entire days. But I'd like to thank the Secretariat of the Basel Convention and Francesca and her colleagues very much for giving me this opportunity to provide an overview of what kinds of e-waste policies there are around the world. And I'll try to fit all of that into a 30-minute presentation followed by a question and answer session. And I really look forward to your answers, to your questions, and I try to answer them in the second half of this session. What I put here on this slide is a graph or an overview that I found in a relatively recent publication about e-waste regulation globally. And you don't need to look at the details. The main message that I wanted to convey here is that we do see a very different mix of legislation. We do see a global patchwork of some countries or regions having introduced e-waste policies, some others, which would be the beige colored countries on this map, that have not yet adopted a national e-waste policy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not working on one, that they don't have any other programs. But we actually do see a very colorful picture of very different kinds of policies. So maybe a few basic assumptions of my presentation. I do assume that all participants are familiar with the basics of the e-waste problem, so I'm not trying to get into the details of why we need e-waste policy. I assume that most of you are familiar with that, and I rather like to focus on what kind of policies there are and what kind of regulation there is to address them. What we clearly see when we look at this question from a global perspective is that e-waste is growing relatively fast in Western countries, in Europe, in the US, but it's also growing very rapidly in developing countries. And there are estimations that in the near future, developing countries will produce through their own consumption and use of electronics more e-waste than Western countries. So we clearly don't have the classical problem constellation anymore in which Western countries would produce the waste and ship it to developing countries that then suffer from the negative implications. But clearly we see a shift of the problem of the constellation where e-waste is produced and used, and how the problem actually shifts with that and the need for regulation. So I don't say that that shipments and trade, and especially illegal trade, is not a problem. It still is, but we actually see a different layer that's being added to the problem that needs to be addressed with appropriate regulation. So the type of regulation that is needed in any country has shifted from this shift in the problem, actually. So just banning trade is not going to solve it. And also regulation in developing countries, also some measures in developing countries seem very necessary. One general comment as well, as you all know, there are many countries on the world. I'm not an expert in the details of every single regulation on this planet. I myself have worked most closely on European Union regulation, US regulation, and Chinese regulation, and that's also then the first three regions with which I'll start. But I will try to speak about other regions as well, but in a bit more of a general overview, and probably someone of you is more of an expert in some South American or African policy than I am, but so I hope we can have a good discussion about that. So what you see here is the overview of what I'll try to do. I try to have a large or broad geographical coverage of different regions and laws that there are. I'll start with Europe, then move across the Atlantic to the US, then around the world to China, and then finishing with an overview of some of the problems or developments that we see in Africa and in South America. Good, so let's get started. Let's get started with Europe, and actually more specifically the European Union. I hope that you all are familiar with the basics of the European Union. It basically is something between a confederation and a federal state amongst 28 European countries, and in some areas, including environmental and electronic waste policy, the European Union level actually plays a very important role. The EU has adopted one of the first e-waste extended producer responsibility laws in the world. Only Japan and Taiwan actually adopted e-waste EPR laws before the EU, but the scope of these two laws in Japan and Taiwan were actually much more restricted, and the extent to which they adopted the principle of EPR was also much more limited compared to the EU's application of this principle, and then really defining or designing a relatively broad and ambitious law. So we really see the EU as going ahead, being a pioneer in adopting extended producer responsibility law, and that's actually the label, the name of that law. So in 2002, the EU adopted what they call the WE Directive. The entire name is the Directive on Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment. That was meanwhile revised with a few changes, but no fundamental changes. So the WE Directive requires producers of electrical and electronic equipment to finance the collection, the treatment, and the recycling of their products. It sets recovery and recycling targets, defines minimum standards for the treatment of e-waste, and producers must put a label on their products. So you can already tell that the scope it's quite broad, and it's actually quite ambitious. It makes individual producers responsible for covering the cost of collection, treatment, recovery, and disposal of their product, but they can fulfill that obligation in collective schemes. And that's what we generally see. So we have producers being individually made responsible, but they can assume that responsibility collectively. Was that a question? No. In 2011, that directive was revised. They included some provisions on illegal exports of e-waste, made some definitions more explicit, did some harmonizations of registries, because that was adopted differently in the 28 member states, which caused some problems for the companies. So there were some improvements done. The most important one, I think, is that it sets a collection target of 85% of e-waste generated in one of the European countries' territory must be collected. Or alternatively, 65% of the average weight of e-waste placed on that market must be collected. So these are very ambitious targets. They apply as from 2019, so not yet. And if you look at figures, most member states are not yet at these collection targets. So there's still quite some work to be done also in European countries. So although they adopt this extended producer responsibility law, which is very ambitious, there also still remains quite some scope for improvement, fixing problems and the like. European e-waste policy actually has two components. One is this e-waste, this WE Directive that I just briefly outlined, and the second one is the so-called ROS Directive, the Directive on the Restriction of the Use of Certain Hazardous Substances in electrical and electronic equipment. So here, the thinking or the reason for adopting not only a law on the collection and recycling of electronics, but also one that relates to the product itself. So this is a product policy. This bans or restricts the use of certain hazardous substances in certain products, in electronic products. And the reason here is that, of course, the environmental and health problems that are caused by electronics derive from the hazardous substances that are used in them. And if you would not use any hazardous substances in these electronics, then of course also the problems at the end of life of these products would be diminished or reduced or eliminated entirely. So here really we see this approach that addresses almost the entire supply or life cycle of a product, not just the end of life, but also already the production and the design of the product stage is addressed. And that law certainly was a pioneering law. No other law globally had banned these 6 substances. Meanwhile, it's more than 6, but initially it was 6 substances, including lead, mercury, and some others from these electronic products. And here again we have a revision that was adopted in 2012, and that included a few more provisions, a few more substances. Now there needs to be, it requires the CE marking, which is a conformity marking, and the scope was basically extended to all electrical and electronic equipment. So if we summarize the European Union approach, we do see a top-down approach. The European Union level actually adopted these 2 directives that then needed to be transposed by each of the member states of the European Union that, obviously needed to enforce the ban of these restrictive substances, implement the collection systems, try to transpose all the requirements that the EU level adopted into the national law. And so that's in the course of time that actually was more and more harmonized since, oops, I thought I had another one. Since producers didn't really like discrepancies between the different member states. So that's very quickly trying to explain the basics of the European approach. If we now look at the United States, we see a very different picture. So this is not the world, this is just the US, but it looks almost as colorful as the entire world. So in the US, we do see a lot of activity at the state level, at the subnational level, as opposed to the federal level. So far, there are 25 states plus the District of Columbia, in which Washington, well, which is basically Washington, have adopted an e-waste law. But if we compare that to the EU, there are many differences. So basically, we do have well, no, hang on. I first want to say something about the federal level. So at the federal level, we almost don't have any e-waste regulation. We have a few rules and a few provisions, mainly in the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovering Act, where a very narrow subset of equipment containing CRTs, cathode ray tubes, are covered and then are considered hazardous waste. But that excludes household waste and small quantity generators. So all the TVs from the households are not covered in there. So it's very narrow, and you can almost neglect that when you think about e-waste regulation in the US in general, because it's just a very, very small part. This development started in 2003, so very shortly after the EU adopted its laws. US states also became active, and California was the first one to adopt an e-waste law. As in many other environmental regulations, they act as a leader also in this case. So in 2003, they adopted their law, and then we see a wave of state laws basically between 2007 and 2010. So there we see most of these blue countries, states on that map, actually adopting very different kinds of e-waste regulation. So we don't see one model that's being applied in all of these states. And some of these laws also have been changed meanwhile, adopted to certain circumstantial developments. So if we look at this, I called it a subnational domination of e-waste regulation in the United States. They We often actually see the term product stewardship, product responsibility, as opposed to producer responsibility. So that actually is an interesting semantic difference between some of the other regions in the world, where you can often find that it's stressed that it's related to the product and it's not a responsibility limited to the producer only, so that consumers and some others, retailers, for example, also do have some responsibility. So it's just a minor detail, but sometimes in these discourses I find that an interesting observation. But nonetheless, most of the state laws do adopt an EPR type legislation. But the state laws differ very much in scope of the covered devices, producers' obligations, registration and reporting requirements, and the ways in which take-back and recycling systems are to be designed. Apart from California and Utah, every state has some form of EPR. California has an advanced recovery fee, which basically asks consumers to pay a fee at the point in time when they purchase a product. So they already pay for the recycling when they buy the product. And Utah has a very light e-waste law, if you want to label it like that. It only has information requirements. So producers need to inform consumers about recycling, about possibilities for recycling, about the need for recycling and the like, and there's some reporting requirements for manufacturers, but actually no requirement to set up any collection system or the like. We do see differences in terms of how the take-back programs are designed, how much and how, on what basis producers have to pay their share. So in some systems, producers pay according to the amount of products that they place on the market. In some others, producers actually pay according to the amount of e-waste collected. And there you actually have an individual producer responsibility scheme. So there really the collection points look at the brands, write down which brand comes in, and then the manufacturers are charged based on the amount of products that really come in with their own brand. So that's very interesting policies, because they basically take this thought of extended producer responsibility to, I would say, even the next level, where really producers are responsible for their very own product and would potentially have a greater incentive for changing the design of their products, because, you know, they really pay for that. So some very interesting details that one could look in there, but we don't have the time to do that right now. In terms of the scope, especially if you compare it with the European Union WE directive, most of the laws are much narrower. Most of them address TVs, monitors, and computers. So you wouldn't have this broad range that we have in the EU, which basically covers almost all electrical and electronic equipment, so also washing machines and vending machines and all these kind of things. So much more limited. Also, not all of them actually refer to recycling standards. Some of them have very weak own recycling standards. Some of them have no collection targets, some others do. So, you know, in terms of stringency, they differ very much. Then, if we look at this second part of the European Union e-waste policy, what I mentioned, the restriction of hazardous substances, that's actually something we almost don't see in the US. Only California and New Jersey actually have provisions in their law that refer to the restrictions of hazardous substances, and what they do is referring to the European Union law. So there in the US, we do see much more collection, e-waste, recycling kind of laws, but not so much on the hazardous substances side. At the federal level, as I said, there's no real legislation. There were a number of proposals, a number of attempts, but nothing actually passed the legislative process. But we do have some voluntary measures. the Environmental Protection Agency adopted, together with producers, NGOs, the so-called responsible recycling practices, R2 practices, which is a recycling standard. And a US NGO, the Basel Action Network, adopted or developed their own recycling standards, the e-stewards standards. So there's a lot being done on that side. The Environmental Protection Agency also launched, it's called EPEAT. It's the Electric Product Environmental Assessment Tools are trying to assess the environmental friendliness, including recyclability of products, which then can guide public procurement. So that there are many measures going on, but not necessarily this broad regulation. And what we do see, well, in the European Union, e-waste exports are banned. Of course, there's some illegal activity. E-waste exports are still possible and allowed in the US in general. You know, there's some provisions in California about reporting, but so export actually is still possible. So if we sum up the US picture, we really see that the states acted as laboratories, as many people often say when they describe the federal system in the United States. But actually, these laboratories, these experiments, never inspired any federal legislation or never generated the impetus that was necessary to adopt some federal legislation. So while in the EU, I said we had quite a top-down development, here we do have a bottom-up, while it's not moving up yet. And, you know, actually in recent years, we rather see stagnations, and I'm not sure whether that we will actually ever see a federal, an ambitious federal e-waste law here. Good, so that was the United States. Let's move around the world to China, where I labeled it slow progress. So China certainly has been active on e-waste regulations, has been active for quite some time, and I apologize for my animation. It didn't work out too well. So actually from the early 2000s, we do see development in China. Of course, mainly triggered by the massive environmental and health problems that they faced due to illegal or, well, sometimes legal imports of e-waste. So really, initially, it was e-waste from the West being shipped to recycling sites in China, causing all the problems of which we've seen many of these horrible photos. And China so then became active. But the structure of laws in China is very different. So while they have framework laws, they need to be implemented through standards, through legislation to actually have real, to have real requirements that affect some of the regulated community, and that's where a lot of the problems actually lie. So already in 2002, the Chinese administrative measures for controlling pollution caused by electric information products was adopted, and that was actually a ROS type, so a restriction of hazardous substances type of regulation. So in China, we see much more development, faster development in the area of restriction of hazardous substances than in the e-waste collection and recycling area. Although, as I said, you know, while there are provisions on paper, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's real action required by producers, companies, consumers, and the like. So these 2002 administrative measures include a large number of products that are a bit different from the European Union scope, but in the recent law that was actually adopted and published not that long ago this year, they streamlined and took over a lot of the European Union definitions, or made their own definitions very similar to the EU one. So we do see some convergence here. And this law initially only required labeling of the content, the hazardous substances content in products, but did not ban the use yet. And then in the second stage, a catalog actually of the products that would be covered by a ban would need to be developed, and then the ban would apply. And then, you know, one of the reasons why I called it slow progress was that this catalog was announced for a certain period of time, and then but did not materialize by the deadline. In the end, it was a voluntary and not a compulsory requirement. So it really dragged on due to various reasons. And I guess the main one is that this is quite complex. You know, for some of these substances, there was no alternative yet, or it was difficult to find alternatives for these restricted substances. So actually, it was quite a challenge, and we can see at least part of the reasons for the slow progress in actually really adopting measures that have teeth in this area. But as I said, this year we see some movement, and it's materializing and also becoming closer or more similar to the European requirements. Then if you look at more the e-waste collection and recycling side of things, there was some development in the early 2000s, but resulting in 2008 the adoption of regulations on the recovery and processing of waste electrical and electronic equipment, where basically a sort of extended producer responsibility law was adopted. So basically China adopted administrative measures on the pollution and prevention of waste and electrical and electronic equipment, which are then implemented through these regulations that I mentioned on this slide. The products that they cover includes TVs, fridges, washing machines, air conditioning, and computers. It doesn't address mobile phones and some other products that are quite, causing quite some problems as well. So there's some scope for future enlargement of the scope. So And what this law does is it obliges producers actually to contribute to a special fund that's designated to offset the costs of redisposal and recycling. So that's the EPR element actually. So producers here are now required to pay into a fund which then finances the recycling. But there's still a number of challenges remaining regarding to the implementation and enforcement of that regulation. So in China, we now see more development of the formal e-waste recycling industry, but still the informal sector is quite dominant, is still quite well developed, and there's still a number of social and economic factors that require some more attention or that are not entirely solved yet. So I'm running out of time, I see, but I still, didn't want to have a biased view. I'd quickly like to mention some of the developments in Africa. So here, the title I call Development versus Environmental Protection, since the informal sector, which I mentioned already in the case of China, is quite well developed in a number of African countries, and of course provides a livelihood, provides important income for certain people. So just banning them would also have some negative implications. So there are many considerations that actually are being taken into account. But overall, we really see initiatives in their infancy. There are few laws, there are few proposed laws, there are few initiatives, but we see that still rather in a rather early stage. And wrong button. What we really see here is what I mentioned in one of the early slides, is that initially the e-waste problem was very much linked to trade. So trade, e-waste coming from other countries, from Western countries to African countries, and then causing problems there. But increasingly, it's also domestically produced waste. So the problem that these laws need to address is actually changing, or has changed in recent years. So just an import ban is not going to solve the problem anymore. And of course, would also not solve the problem of economic development. Yeah, so there's some considerations that need to be taken into account, people's livelihood, but of course health and environmental considerations being very important. And one of the main challenges that many of these countries face is, of course, capacity, and capacity of various kinds. So there's a general lack of e-waste management infrastructure in many countries, but also administrative capacity, companies' capacity. We do see some problems that would make the adoption of an EPR system like we have in Europe, for example, very difficult, because there are no domestic manufacturers. All the products are imported and not necessarily produced in the countries. So actually the conditions differ very much from other countries, which most likely also require some different solutions from the laws that we've seen so far. Good. I'm very quickly moving to South America, and there I call it a recent awakening. So what we see there is, in some ways a bit similar to some other countries, maybe to Africa, in the sense that, that it's relatively recent development, that many of the measures are still in their infancy. So what we see is, since more or less 2010, there's an increasing activity in a number of actually Latin American countries. But not many countries have national law. So we see some similarities to the United States. So Costa Rica, Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador have some national e-waste legislation. Brazil and Chile work on some, but in many countries we see subnational, we see state level or municipal level activities in the area of e-waste. And we also see many different kinds of policies. So we see some extended producer responsibilities, but also some other types, making the municipalities responsible for collecting and different things, adopting recycling requirements. But in general, I mentioned capacity in the case of Africa. What we do see in Latin America as well is that the availability of recycling facilities that fulfill R2 standards or some other of the standards that were adopted in the US and in the EU, they're not very widely spread yet. So we do see still a need to actually build up the capacity, the recycling capacity, the facilities that actually could address and could recycle the e-waste that needs to be addressed through regulation, and that's being collected. If we think about the restriction of hazardous substances, there's almost no ROS provision in these countries. There are very few, I think 2, that mention it, but in general, here the focus as well is much more on e-waste collection and recycling type of regulation, so the EPR and other types. So basically, I call it here work in progress. But they're really working, and there's a lot going on, and it's very interesting developments in Latin America. So very briefly summing up my tour around the world. So I guess it's not a surprising conclusion that we really do see a patchwork of different requirements, countries in different stages with regard to their e-waste regulation, but also linked to their capacities of handling the e-waste, of enforcing their potential regulation and the like. What we also do see is there are various designs of regulation. So the European Union would have a relatively classic extended producer responsibility design. I mentioned some of the US states really have quite some features of individual producer responsibility, but we also have the Californian advanced fee approach or the Utah information approach. I mentioned that in some other countries it's the responsibility is not necessarily placed on the producers and the like. So there's some very interesting variation there. And that's mainly linked to or often linked to the domestic context. You know, the politics are different, the strength and influence of different companies is different, but also the type of domestic companies differs, the amount and type of e-waste differs. So many, and the capacity, recycling facilities capacity and the like, collection capacity, that all differs very much in these different countries and regions. And of course, provide an explanation for why these laws, if we see them, differ very much. In general, we do see very few ROS provisions. There are very few provisions on the restriction of hazardous substances. But that's mainly due, or to some extent due, that the EU actually was a global standard setter in that area. And if you remember, I called it a product-related regulation. So they regulated a product that's produced in a global supply chain. So while it was an EU regulation, actually many producers that are based outside of the EU wanted to sell and still wanted to sell their products in the EU had to comply with it. So we sort of see a global phase out or a restriction of many of these substances, although many countries don't have explicit legislation in that area. And another development or interesting aspect that we see is that many of these laws, if we look at national laws, we absolutely don't see the entire picture. So there's a lot going on at the subnational level, at the state level, or at the municipal level. So yeah, a number of laws actually are being, or other measures, programs are being adopted below the federal level. And the European Union is one of the exceptions here, where at the supranational level, the regulation was adopted. China would be another one where actually federal legislation is being adopted, but they also do have subnational pilots and the like. Good, that was my rushing through the worlds of e-waste regulation. I hope it was clear, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.